All right, yeah! Thank God for fantasy football. I'm Buster Brown, and the show is called Redemption Rehab. Today, we're talking about the weekly waiver wire report for those must-have guys you need to pick up before Week 11 of the NFL season, starting with this guy, Audric Estime of the Denver Broncos. He's only owned in 3% of fantasy football leagues. He's a running back. He only carried the ball 14 times for 53 yards this week. He's the handcuff to Javonte Williams. Jaleel McLaughlin's out there. I tell you what, it's a three-headed monster out in Denver, but a lot of guys think this guy might get some playing time out there in Denver to see what he's got. We talked about him in our NFL draft preview show earlier this year, where we show highlights of rookies coming into the NFL that will impact fantasy football. You can check that video out in the link in the description, or if you're watching this on YouTube, at the tab above. Anyways, who else do we like? I'll tell you what, you got to go out and get this guy too. How about Gus Edwards of the Los Angeles Chargers? He's a running back. He's only owned in 20% of fantasy football leagues. Last week he was 10 carries for 55 yards, and he's the handcuff to J.K. Dobbins. So if you got J.K. Dobbins, playoffs are coming up, you got to get yourself some Gus Edwards. Who else do we like at running back? How about this guy? We love Cam Akers over there in Minnesota. He's only owned in 15% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he had 13 carries for 38 yards, and he caught one ball for 9 yards on one target. He's the handcuff to Aaron Jones and Ty Chandler. Aaron Jones has a rib injury, might not play this week, so look for Cam Akers to get some carries. Who else do we like at running back? Well, I'll tell you what, man, you better get your handcuffs heading into the playoffs. It's Week 11. Playoffs start in some leagues in Week 15 and 16. You better go out and get Ray Davis of the Buffalo Bills. How about Trey Benson down there in Arizona for James Conner? And don't forget about Jalen Wright, who's going to get some playing time as the season goes on down there in Miami. Have your handcuffs ready. Who else do we like? Well, I'll tell you what, man. Everybody's going to be going after this guy at wide receiver. We told you last week about Quentin Johnson. Everybody picked him up. He scored a touchdown. That's why you hit this subscribe button. But what about Marquise Valdez-Scantling, a veteran wide receiver? He's down there in New Orleans now. He's only owned in 1% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he had a big week. 3 catches for 109 yards and 2 touchdowns on 3 targets. Not saying he's going to do that every week, but who else does New Orleans have to throw the ball to? They got a tough matchup with Cleveland, so be careful with this guy, but he's worth putting on your bench. I tell you what, we've been talking about these two guys all year. Hit that subscribe button. Why? Because Ricky Pearsall down there in San Francisco, again, owned in 40% of fantasy football leagues, had 4 catches for 73 yards and a touchdown on 6 targets. And his running mate with the injury to Brandon Ayuk, Jawan Johnson of San Francisco, wide receiver, he's owned in 65% of fantasy football leagues, so he's probably not available in your league. But we've been talking about him all year. He had 7 catches for 93 yards on 11 targets. Other guys we like, how about Elijah Moore over there in Cleveland? He was on bye last week. He's going to get you 7 or 8 targets, maybe 8 to 10 fantasy points. And Jalen Coker, a rookie down there in Carolina, he's only owned in 10% of fantasy football leagues. Last week against the New York Giants in Germany, he had 3 catches for 41 yards on 8 targets. We talked about Mike Williams, who used to play for the Los Angeles Chargers. Now he plays for the Pittsburgh Steelers after being traded from the Jets. He's owned in 20% of fantasy football leagues. Last week he got some playing time, managed to catch 1 ball for 32 yards and a touchdown on 1 target. Hey, I'll tell you what, man. These 2 guys are guys you must have. Michael Pittman keeps getting hurt, man. If he's not going to play, who replaces him? How about Adonai Mitchell? Another guy we talked about in our NFL draft preview show where we show highlights of rookies coming into the NFL. Check out that in the link in the description or at the link above. I'll tell you what, man. Adonai Mitchell for the Indianapolis Colts wide receiver is only owned in 5% of fantasy football leagues. He's turning it on. He's a big body guy. He had 6 catches for 71 yards on 6 targets. And how about Alex Pierce, another guy we were talking about all year? He plays for the Indianapolis Colts. He's owned in 50% of fantasy football leagues. He had 4 catches for 81 yards and a touchdown on 7 targets. And a guy we haven't talked about all year, how about John Mechie of the Houston Texans? He's only owned in 1% of fantasy football leagues. Last week with the injury to Nico Collins, who's still out, might come back this week. He had 5 catches for 74 yards and a touchdown. I'll tell you what, man, you got to go out and get yourself some of these guys we talked about. Who else do we like? Well, I'll tell you what, if you need a tight end, how about going out and getting you? We've been talking about him all year, Jonnu Smith. You know, the guy just catches 4 or 5 balls a game, maybe gets you 40 yards. But if he gets you a touchdown, which he could do, he's a good pickup. He is available in most leagues. He's only been taken in like 35% of fantasy football leagues. So he might be out there. And another guy we've been talking about for a long time, hit that subscribe button that would have helped you out most of this year, is Mike Gesicki of the Cincinnati Bengals. Last week he didn't do as well as we thought. He's only owned in 45% of fantasy football leagues, so he might not be available in your league. But last week, 4 catches for 30 yards on 9 targets with the absence of T. Higgins. I'll tell you what, a guy you also have to keep an eye out for in Cincinnati is Tanner Hudson. He's another tight end. He had 6 catches for 42 yards and a touchdown on 7 targets. Hey, T. Higgins comes back. These guys aren't going to be as productive, but I tell you what, we're not sure where T. Higgins is. He said he's only playing if he's healthy. Next year, he's a free agent. Who else do we like at tight end? How about this guy? Dawson Knox of the Buffalo Bills. Dalton Kincaid might be hurt. They play Kansas City, then they go on bye. I wouldn't be surprised if Dalton Kincaid didn't play next week. So, Dawson Knox is only owned in 1% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, with Kincaid hurt, he had 2 catches for 40 yards on 3 targets. Like I said, next week they play the Kansas City Chiefs. Then they go on bye. I look for them to put Dalton Kincaid on ice and play Dawson Knox. Who else do we like at tight end? A guy we've been talking about for a while, and he keeps producing. How about Will Dissly of the Los Angeles Chargers? Yeah, he's only owned in 2% of fantasy football leagues, yet he had 5 catches for 30 yards on 6 targets. And I'll tell you what, if Sam Laporta's hurt, which he's got a shoulder injury, pick up Brock Wright, put him in there for a couple weeks, he might produce. Who else do we like? I'll tell you what, if you need yourself a kicker, how about these guys? Dustin Hopkins of the Cleveland Browns. They were on bye last week. They played New Orleans. He's only owned in 15% of fantasy football leagues. And how about Will Lutz out there in Denver? He's going down there to play Atlanta in a dome, and he's only owned in 10% of fantasy football leagues. And I'll tell you what, you guys that need a quarterback, Bo Nix isn't available. I'd be looking to see if Russell Wilson's available. Russell Wilson for the Pittsburgh Steelers is owned in 30% of fantasy football leagues. Last week he was 14 of 28 for 195 yards and 3 touchdowns, and his quarterback rating was 93. Or maybe if you're in desperate need, you go out there and get yourself another rookie we talked about in our NFL draft preview show, Drake May of the New England Patriots. He's only owned in 15% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, had another decent outing, 15 of 25 for 184 yards and a touchdown. His quarterback rating was 80. And I'll tell you what, man, Jameis Winston's going back down to New Orleans. He's going to light the Saints up. He's only owned in 10% of fantasy football leagues. He plays for the Cleveland Browns. Last week they were on bye. So I look for Jameis Winston to kind of go home and say, hey, man, you should have kept me. Who else do we like? I tell you what, if you need a defense, go out and get yourself the Houston Texans. They got a good matchup against Dallas. Then they play Tennessee and then the Jacksonville Jaguars. And if you need a good defense just for this week, go out and pick yourself up the Cleveland Browns against the New Orleans Saints. I look for Cleveland after the bye to put a whooping on these guys. And I'll tell you what, get yourself ready for your playoffs. If you think you're going to make the playoffs and you need a defense to put on the bench or maybe for your playoff run, get the Arizona Cardinals. They play the New England Patriots in the playoffs, the Carolina Panthers in the playoffs, and the Los Angeles Rams. They should put up some decent points like they've been doing all year. Anyways, that's it for the Week 11 Waiver Wire Report. I'm Buster Brown. The show is called Redemption Rehab. Good luck.